Interview with Michel Foucault, English translation. I had first studied philosophy and later had studied psychology and psychopathology, and there was something that had both struck and intrigued me. You see, Western civilization has been familiar for a very long time, since the Greek era, with the phenomenon of madness. Mad people are present in plays and in literature. Madness used to be a subject spoken about incessantly, and it is not until the 19th century that madness became an object of science. However, from the 17th century, mad people were taken out of society, they were secluded. My history of madness is indeed best illustrated in one of the most famous paintings of Dutch art by Frans Hals, namely in The Regents. In The Regents of the hospital, there around a table are these 5 old women whose job it is to run this house of imprisonment, where during the 17th and later, during the 18th century, all socially worthless people, the troublemakers, were imprisoned. These women are actually the expression of our society's rationalization that sets madness apart. It is from here on that the science of madness was able to develop. Precisely from the moment when we parted with this old familiarity that we used to have with madness, based on purely historical research that I did, I wondered if, after all, we Westerners are deceiving ourselves greatly. We readily imagine that we are a very tolerant civilization, that we have welcomed all the forms of the past, all the cultural forms foreign to us, that we welcome also behavior, language, and sexual deviations, etc. I wonder if this is an illusion. In other words, in order to know madness, it first had to be excluded. Maybe could we also say that in order to know other cultures, non-Western cultures, so-called primitive cultures, or American, African, and Chinese culture, etc. In order to know these cultures, we must no doubt have had not only to marginalize them, not only to look down upon them, but also to exploit them, to conquer them, and in some ways, through violence, to keep them silent. We suppressed madness, and as a result, came to know it. We suppressed foreign cultures, and as a result, came to know them. And perhaps we might say that it is not until the great Puritanism of the 19th century that sexuality was first suppressed, and was then known finally in psychoanalysis or psychology or in psychopathology. So, if you will, my hypothesis is this: the universality of our knowledge has been acquired at the cost of exclusions, bans, denials, rejections, at the price of a kind of cruelty with regard to reality. And so I have tried to see if we could research other forms of knowledge to see in what way they had been constructed, what their unconscious roots were, what their implicit forms were, roots and forms which scientists were not aware of at the time of their work. This is what I more or less call doing archaeology of knowledge. And this is how, in the order of things, I have tried to compare a number of fields of knowledge: biology, economics, linguistics, from the 17th century to the 19th century. I have tried to see how these fields of knowledge, which are quite different from one another, nevertheless follow a certain number of the same laws and rules. These rules are inevitably unconscious, in the sense that they are found in different fields of knowledge, in spite of the fact that the scientists of each field do not know the other disciplines. Imagine a photograph representing a face. If you make this image go from positive to negative, in a way all the dots of the picture are going to be modified. That is to say, that all the points that were white will become black, and that all the points that were black will become white. None of the points, none of the elements therefore remain identical, and yet you can recognize the face, and yet the face remains the same even though it has gone from positive to negative, and you can say that it stays the same. You recognize it because the relations between all these different elements have remained the same. Relations between the points have stayed the same, or the relations of contrast and of opposition between white and black have remained the same, even though each dot that was white has become black and each point that was black has become white. Deep down, in a very broad sense of what structuralism is, we can say that structuralism is the method of analysis that consists of drawing constant relations from elements that in themselves, in their own character, in their substances, can change. Structuralists are people for whom what counts is essence, are systems of relations, and thus not at all the lived individual experience of people. What I do belongs at heart, like structuralism, to this great questioning of the sovereignty of the subject. Deep down, what is the experience of drugs, if not to erase limits, to reject divisions, to put away all prohibitions, and then ask oneself the question, what has become of knowledge? Do we then know something altogether other? Can we still know what we knew before the experience of drugs? Is this knowledge of before drugs still valid, or is it a new knowledge? This is a real problem, and I think that in this measure, the experience of drugs isn't marginal in our society. It's not a sort of little deviance that does not count. It seems to me that it is at the very heart of the problems that the society in which we live, that is to say, in the capitalist society, is confronted with. Well, it seems to me also that Mausim is furthermore in a very different historical scope and also a certain way to identify this problem. That is to say, from the moment when humanity will actually be liberated from the system of constraint. Not only the system of economic constraint, but the system of political, moral, cultural constraint that capitalism has oppressed man with for centuries. From the moment liberation will have been achieved, then what kind of knowledge will be possible? Well, listen, you are saying that I refuse to speak about my personal life, but I don't see it I've been talking about for the past half an hour, if not my personal life, laughs. That's the first thing I would tell you. And also I would tell you this. We are used to thinking that the expression of the individuality, for example, or the exaltations of individuality is one of the forms of man's liberation. But I wonder if the opposite is true. I've tried to show how humanism was a kind of form. Was this sort of fabrication of the human being according to a certain model, and that humanism does not work at all as a liberation of man, but on the contrary works as imprisonment of man inside certain types of molds that are all controlled by the sovereignty of the subject. To the extent that in maybe a rather obsessive way, this problem of limitation, exclusion, subjection, of a battle of strength of subordination interests me, well, it is clear that the problem of justice, of law, of punitive action, of the police, of prison, etc., are for me very, very important. And with a group of people made up of various different individuals, we have created a group that is called the Prison Information Group, which is at heart a group that is not a theoretical nature, but a group focused on attacking the repressive system in the way it works in France and probably also in other countries. However, our attack is centered, of course, on what surrounds us right here and right now, namely, the system, if you will, justice, police, in the way it maintains, extends, perpetuates all the imperatives and all the moral, social, and judicial limitations in our society. Additionally, I am going to tell you something about what I've been telling you, and it is fully relevant for this interview. I don't say the things I say because they are what I think. I say them as a way to make sure they no longer are what I think. I don't believe in the virtue of using language for self-expression. The language that interests me is the one that can actually destroy all the circular, enclosed, narcissistic forms of the subject and of oneself. And what I mean by the end of man, deep down, the end of all these forms of individuality, of the subjectivity, of consciousness, of the ego, on which we built and from which we have tried to build and to constitute knowledge. This is one of the forms of this limitation, of these exclusions, of these rejections that I was talking about. The West has tried to build the figure of man in this way, and this image is in the process of disappearing. And so I don't say the things I say because they are what I think, but rather I say them with the end in mind of self-destruction, precisely to make sure they are no longer what I think, to be really certain that from now on, outside of me, they are going to live a life or die in such a way that I will not have to recognize myself in them.